You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in this show are that of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, Secular Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. How can I live in society if I don't believe in God? How can I understand the world around me without religion? What can I do to make the world a better place? Where did we come from? How can I be a moral person? These are just some of the profound questions we as humans have pondered for millennia. Join us as we ponder these questions free from the ideologies of religion and superstition. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective.
This is your host, Andrew, and this week we bring you another special episode from one of FreeThought Fort Wayne's educational lectures. This is Dr. Bruce Kingsbury, Professor and Director of the IPFW Environmental Resources Center. The lecture is titled, Shallow Wetlands, Complex Thoughts.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks for joining us. So I am Kenny, current leader of Fort Wayne FreeThought. And for this month's educational event, we are having Dr. Kuznaar here to give a speech on wetlands. So today's event title is Shallow Wetlands, Deep Thoughts. Dr. Kingsbury has had an excellent focus in conservation of endangered reptiles and has managed the restoration of wildlife habitat. He's also a professor of biology and the head of the Environmental Resource Center at IPFW. Dr. Kingsbury?
All right, well, can we dim the lights maybe just a little bit? I got pretty pictures. All right. Well, thanks for the invitation, and happy to be here. The implication of the title there is that I want to speak about shallow wetlands and why they're important, and then also go from that to talk about thinking about them as complexes rather than just as individual wetlands. So that sort of captures the overall target I have for us today. See if I can learn this quickly or not. Maybe I need to turn it on or something like that. Okay, so what did you do?
I clicked on the screen. We should be good now. Oh, maybe. Yep, there you go.
All right, good, thank you. Well, so before I get too far into things, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about me and show you where you could find out more about what I do. I have a website which is, that one is for making the screen blank, but this one, we have one for a laser pointer.
Is that the middle one? Right in the middle?
Yes, all right, now we're fully trained. Okay, so there is the address for my website, just myname.org, and then you can learn a lot about the kinds of research that I do, my research team, and also about various sorts of outreach materials that I strive to produce. And also, you can go and find out about the Environmental Resources Center that Kenny mentioned earlier. This is a relatively new endeavor for us. It's one of the centers of excellence over at IPFW, and I direct it. And the website for that is erc.ipfw.edu. And at that site, you can learn about the ERC. You can sign up down there in the corner to get on our news brief newsletter list. And we're starting to develop various sorts of outreach materials as well, but mostly we've just been striving to increase awareness through our news brief. We do other sorts of things. This is a book that I co-authored and co-edited with a colleague called Habitat Management Guidelines for Amphibians and Reptiles in the United States, Midwestern United States, and that's chock full of details about all different sorts of habitats, wetlands being one of them, and it's really devoted to targeting land managers, resource managers, and giving them current information for them to consider while they're making decisions on the ground. We're also involved with the potential for an environmental stewardship downtown here in Fort Wayne. I don't know if some of you have noticed this, but as part of the riverfront development, there's the notion of Headwaters Junction, which is focusing on rail, and then environmental stewardship is another concept that might take off. So we might have a facility down by the river, which would focus on things like solar, proper handling of runoff, environmental education, all that kind of stuff. But for tonight, I wanted to focus on wetlands at the two levels that I've already alluded to. One is talking about shallow wetlands, and then about wetland complexes. And within that agenda, one of the things I wanted to get out of the way right away was if people think about water being a place where mosquitoes breed, and that they should all be drained and that they're bad. So I don't have to talk about it later. What I'll point out about wetland, natural, intact ecosystem types of water bodies have a variety of predators that are right in the water with the mosquitoes. And they have a lot of things like bats flying over the water that can eat the mosquitoes once they metamorphose into adults. And so if you're actually near an ephemeral wetland that's healthy, there's fewer mosquitoes there than someplace where it doesn't even exist. So it's not detrimental. And it actually turns out that the mosquitoes which cause disease for humans aren't even very dominant in those sorts of habitats. Instead, where they are prevalent is in things like non-functional gutters, tires, trash, where there's just little pools of water, and where they can develop. So it's actually entirely different species of mosquito. So there. So I want to point out to you that even if the wetlands dry up, they're still pretty good. And in fact, a lot of the wetlands that are the most critical for wildlife actually have to do that. And they house an amazing diversity of wildlife. And then we'll get to the wetland complex notion, looking at why variety matters and connectivity is important. And then I'll close with just talking about roads. So to introduce our ephemeral wetlands, and in doing that, I realize I've thrown out another term there. Shallow wetlands are important, but typically what we're really looking at are what we would call seasonal wetlands or ephemeral wetlands. These are wetlands that don't stay there all year long, and they very frequently dry down. Sometimes they dry really quickly, other times they last for 6 months, and even other times they might last the entire year. But they're always at risk for drying down, but they're still very important. So here's the tale of the ephemeral wetland. So this person is posing, or somebody representing them is posing in about the same spot in a series of slides here. And so we're at December 30th. Here's a log with a little saw cut in it, and then there's a a tree that has fallen over, and you can see it forms kind of a Y. And then here's March. So there's still an icy glaze on top. The person has had to walk out and break through that. But here's that log, and there's the little saw cut, and there's our other representative. So, but now it has water in it. So it's what's called a vernal wetland. Vernal referring to spring. There's also other wetlands in areas called autumnal wetlands, and those just fill in the autumn. So it has the water now. But it isn't until May or June when everything leaves out that you would go there and go, okay, yeah, there's our wetland. But there's our log. It's kind of floating around, and there's a saw cut though, and there's our other rep. But now everything's vegetated, so we can't see through like we did before. And okay, that makes sense. That should have wildlife and everything in it, just that we can all agree on that. But the problem is in October it's all gone again. So if you didn't know about wetlands, you might come here and you might have no idea that actually had been full of water several months before. And then we're back to where we started. So now what I want to do is impose the life history of just one frog, the wood frog, on top of that. And so in early spring, the frogs come out of the woods. The females lay thousands of eggs. They metamorphose very quickly into little miniature adults. There's quite a few species where this takes 2 or 3 months. And so we go from this critter here that just feeds on algae, it's just an herbivore, and I'm sure you all know that adult frogs are carnivorous, insectivorous. And here's one that's metamorphosing, and so it's kind of stuck in between. At this point, it actually can't eat anything. It's just its jaw structure is changing into the adult form. It's absorbing its tail, and now it has legs where it didn't have legs before. And then by the time everything dries down, the frogs, there's little tiny pseudo-adults, sort of sub-adult frogs, and by the following spring, they very likely could mate. Now, just for fun, when we get to winter, it turns out that these frogs hibernate in the uplands, not actually in the water, and they can tolerate freezing. So here's a frogsicle. You can literally take that out and move it around. It'll have like ice on it. But if we took the frog and we put it on the table and we waited for a while, after a while the heart would start beating and it would start breathing again, and after a while it would walk away. Maybe even hop, but I think it would take a little while. So that's pretty cool. So clearly, wetlands are important for amphibians, but then they're also important for other things that eat amphibians. That's kind of gruesome, but here's a green heron that would be perfectly happy to eat the frog or the snake. And it's just, what I want to suggest too is what we'll find, given my background, is that I'm going to focus on reptiles and amphibians. But these wetlands are really critical for a wide variety of wildlife. A lot of birds, all kinds of really cool insects, mollusks, spiders, you name it. They're just full of life. So even though they're ephemeral, they're still full of life. And not to leave plants out, there's all kinds of really cool plants that live in wetlands. Here's a yellow lady slipper. So lots of diversity. And the other background thing that I wanted to talk about was that these wetlands are really variable. And the way they vary is in even more ways than I'm listing here, but here's a few. There are all sorts of different depths. They will change over time by drying down. And so it could be that they dry down quickly. It could be that they are very slow to dry down. And they can be flashy. So you can have the water level do this as it goes down. And all of that will contribute to who lives there and what they look like. So here's the Pigeon River up by Mongo. Mongo's over here. But this is just full of different kinds of wetlands. Now, there are rivers. Those aren't wetlands. There are lakes and ponds. Those aren't wetlands. And then there are wetlands, which are typically very shallow systems. And if you go to a view like this, you have the river here, and that's going to be several feet deep. But then you have a mosaic of shrubby wetlands, emergent wetlands. Here's tamarack forest, still wetland. So there's all kinds of diversity. Here's a scrub wetland. So we have water, nice clean water with shrubs growing in there that are specialized for growing in those sorts of situations. Here's what we call an emergent wetland, where vegetation comes up out of the water. The water can be quite shallow, so you could walk around in your mud boots out here. And if it's a good wetland, actually you won't sink. It's pretty firm bottom. Then we have open water out here. Then there's some scrub, and then there's forested wetlands. So there's just all these different kinds of wetlands. Here's an emergent wetland with cattails and sedges and poison sumac. And even this is a type of wetland. This is forest, and if you'll notice, the vegetation isn't complete on the ground, and it looks wet, and in fact it is. And so the ground is saturated. So even though there isn't water sitting there, there's actually water that comes right up to the top of the ground. And all these sorts of things are under threat, although certainly coal mining is not a common thing to happen in northeastern Indiana. It's very much a threat in other sorts of areas where the systems are removed. There's a lot of channelizing. This is a really dramatic example. This is the Patoka River, where they just made the river straight. They took out all the curves. I think there was some sort of scheme on having have barge traffic go up in this. But if anywhere you go out here, you're going to see that there's been a lot of other sorts of modifications. Here's the remnant of a wetland in a farm field. And back here, there's still forest, and that's where it was perhaps too difficult for them to drain. But farmers have been at it for certainly 100 years, trying to drain wetlands, and frequently you'll see the pipes coming out of the edges of agricultural fields. These are called tiles, and they're a system of drains to get rid of the water off the farmland. And consequently, just about all the wetlands in Indiana are gone. Or they're just really highly modified. And here what has happened is a tile has been placed underground so that they can drain this area, and then they can go ahead and drive the farming machinery right through there. And those wetlands that have not been lost are isolated frequently, so that if an animal wants to get from one to the other, it's going to have to take a lot of risk in order to do so. So those are some of the threats. Another thing that happens is either we convert wetlands into ponds, or we make ponds like this, and we think those are pretty, but in fact they're pretty dysfunctional in terms of an aquatic feature. All right, so some data for you. This is a copperbelly water snake. This is a federally threatened species, and you can see that the name for it comes from this color that they have on their belly. And we've been researching them for 20 years now. And I thought I would use them and some other species of water snake as an example of starting to show you that what's really important is shallow water. So these are locations of snakes for 3 species. There's the copperbelly, which is Nerodia erythrogaster neglecta. There's the common water snake, called the Midland water snake down there, where the study was done, Nerodia cipodon pluralis, and then there's a diamondback water snake, Nerodia rhombifer. None of these are venomous. They're just regular old water snakes. And the zero delineation here is where the depth of the water where the animals were found, or if they were found at areas that were elevated above the water line. That's the top part of the graph. And what you should see is that, the copperbelly is really focused on water that's like that deep, not very deep at all. And all of them are in water that's like shin deep. So down like that. So if you're thinking that they can be out there in a pond or something like that, that's actually not where they are. You might see one swimming across, but that's not where they live. As a consequence, that means they're in habitat like this. And then to throw some more stuff at you, here's 2 more species to add to the mix. This one up here is the Blanding's turtle, and that one over there is the spotted turtle, aptly named. These are 2 species that are relatively rare in Indiana and of conservation concern, so we've been working on them off and on for 20 years. So what I thought I'd show you about some of the work that we've done for them is, if you look at a measurement of body size, the plastron is just the bottom of the turtle shell. You just measure it, and that gives you an indication of how big something is. Then over here is the average water depth for turtles that we tracked over a season. So this point is from perhaps 50 observations over the season. And these guys are little, and those guys are the biggest ones. So they're like that big. So we're going from this big to about that big. And then the red dots are for the spotted turtles. In this case, the turtles were all about the same. They're all about this big. What should be readily apparent is that there's a pretty linear relationship between how big they are and the depth of water they use. And if you look over here, the little guys are in water that's like that deep. And so remember where the copperbellies were. They were over here. And then up here is 50 centimeters. That's like knee deep. So the biggest ones are in water that's this deep. So again, anything that's deeper than that, they're not really going to use. And we can look at it in a slightly different way. ABT is adult Blanding's turtle, so that's these guys. Juveniles are the teenagers. They're about that big. The young Blanding's turtles are the pups. And then the spotted turtles are in the red. And it turns out, if you look at that there's a bit of a distribution between the different sizes of these turtles and the kinds of habitats they're in. And basically I've arranged these so that this is really shallow, and this is deeper water, and that's the deepest water out over there. And what you should see is that a lot of the turtles, except for really the biggest Blanding's turtles, are just using these really shallow systems. So if we put that in the context of the real world, and here's just one wetland, and there's a legend over here, but really, if it's green, it's not aquatic. If it's a brown, Then it's a shallow system like an emergent. A fen is also a type of emergent wetland. We see scrub, and a little bit of open water. And what I hope you can see from wherever you're sitting is that the points, the different color points fall out in different areas. And if you look down here, blue is for adult Blanny's turtles, so there they are. That's actually the deepest part of the system. Yellow is a juvenile Blanny's turtle. Pink is little tiny guys, and then the spotted turtles are back here in the pockets in the back. So they're actually, depending on how old they are, they're using different parts of the same wetland. So if they didn't have access to those depths and those types of habitat in those areas, they couldn't live there. So if you have just one type of wetland, that's not enough. So hopefully you can see I'm starting to lead you towards the wetland complex notion. So if we take a bunch of different sorts of wetland reptiles and we spread them out over different depths of water, we can do something like this. So here's our little tiny Blanny's turtles. Then as they get bigger, they're in a little deeper water. Then as they get bigger still, they're in deeper water, so we get ourselves out to 1/2 meter. Spotted turtles, we can throw those in there, about there. But if we do start putting other stuff on there, like copperbellies, that's still over on this side. Massasaugas are over here. Kirtland snakes, still over there. And Butler's garter snakes, still over there. So hopefully you can see that this is not very interesting over here. So if we pull the scale out, then we can sort of tease that apart and see that they're actually using a little bit of a difference in the water depth. And then if we add a flashiness axis, that is how much the water goes up and down, then we can start to pull them apart even further. Kind of like that. And I just stretched the imagery to suggest sort of the range over which we would find these different kinds of animals. So what I am trying to emphasize is that they're using different sorts of habitat, even though we know that they're all in ephemeral wetlands, even though we know when they're in shallow wetlands. They're really pretty variable about where they are. And a lot of them spend some time on shore. So the area around the wetlands is also important. And then if you're a turtle, except for maybe one species, and I'm not even sure if that's true, they all have to go on the land to lay their eggs. So here's a painted turtle laying its eggs on the side of a road. So that's kind of risky. But here's a really early study by Burke and Gibbons, who showed something that's really important. When we do have wetland rules that protect wetlands, but here's the boundary that would be protected, and then here are the nesting sites for turtles that lived in that wetland. And so it's like 50, 75, and 100% of an ellipse that includes all of them. And what should be really apparent is the turtles are nesting in areas that are not actually protected. So our efforts to protect the wildlife in the wetland don't even work, according to the rules that we're operating by. So here's another snake. This is a Massasauga. This snake is actually venomous. This is the one and only venomous snake we have in northern Indiana, contrary to what some people may think. And they're also very rare. They're about to be listed as a federally threatened species. So if you see one, you're pretty lucky. I wanted to just throw this species in to talk about how what we also find is that there are certain habitats that are in these areas that are particularly important. And here's a rattlesnake that's still covered in mud because it's just emerged from hibernation, something that's happening that they got started before it got so cold, and then will continue once it warms up again. But came out of this crayfish burrow where it was underwater during the winter. And the ideal conditions for this sort of situation are not that common. And so if you use radio telemetry to keep track of your animals over time, and you just draw a minimum convex polygon, just a shape around the outermost points, what you should see is that, for one, these animals are using fairly large areas. Here's a semi as a comparison. And then, so they're spread all over the place. And then they all go back to right here, an area that's the size of a house. It's actually only half the size of this room. And that's where they all hibernate. If we don't protect that, then we'll just wipe this population out, even though we've done a nice job of protecting this habitat. So we have to pay attention to the special needs of our critters. Then I thought I would go back and show you a little bit more about some work we've done comparing what happens with our copperbellies with the northern water snake. The copperbelly is federally threatened. The northern water snake is everywhere. They're closely related, but one is in trouble and the other is doing fine. If we use radio telemetry and we track them around, these two different colors of orange represent 2 snakes over 1 year, and then these purples represent 2 northern water snakes. And what should stick out to you right away is that the copperbellies are occupying a much larger area, and they're visiting lots of different wetlands, whereas these snakes are just staying in the one wetland. Another area nearby, different snakes, same sort of pattern. And then if we're going to compare what the 2 species are doing over a whole different set of things, what we see is that the species that's in trouble uses twice as many wetlands. It moves 3 times as frequently between the wetlands. It tends to travel between wetlands roughly equivalently, which is interesting, although the biggest moves are made by the copperbellies. The ratio of small wetlands between the copperbelly and the northern is 7-to-1, as is the use of ephemeral wetlands. And then here's something about the area used. Upland habitat is an order of magnitude greater in use. And then they're quite more happy to be farther away from wetlands. They use much larger area. And so when you try to understand why one is in trouble and the other is not, this sort of stuff starts to become pretty revealing. And one of the reasons that you should think about then is if you are a snake and you're trying to bounce around from these wetland to wetland, you have to take risks every time you do that. If you just live, this is your place, you just live here all the time, you don't have that problem. And then the other thing that happens, and this is essentially the last vignette, if you will, for tonight that I want to talk about, is if you start to put data down on maps and you look at what else is happening, what you should see is we have all of these different snakes monitored over different years, and then we have a gravel road with very low traffic going here, and they never ever cross that road. In fact, here's a reservoir, and here's another reservoir, and there's a dirt road there with very little traffic, and it was very rare for them to cross that. This is an old picture, I really should update it, but here's the gravel road, and the observations of the snakes came right up to the road and they stopped. They didn't cross over it. Here's a more recent study down in Muscatatuck National Wildlife Refuge. 2 different snakes here around the visitor center. Here's one looking in the window of the visitor center, waving at the people that are visiting. Here's a couple next to the sidewalk. Clearly, they're not just freaked out about humans, and they're just not going to be anywhere near them. But they never cross that road. They'll come up and they'll bask in the grass next to the road, but they won't cross it. Here's an expansion showing those two snakes that I showed you zoomed in before. But now here's those same two snakes went down here, but they never crossed this road. Here's a snake up in green here, never crosses these roads. This snake never crosses that road. There is one observation for this snake here that somehow seems to have gotten by this. So there it is. And then there's one snake that seems to be pretty happy to be going back and forth. So I could show you lots of different species and lots of different examples, but roads are a real problem. If the snake tries to cross the road, it might get run over. But it's also bad if it doesn't cross the road, because it's not going to breed with the animals on the other side, and so you have fractures of all the populations everywhere. Here's some more examples, and again, these are all relocations. By the way, if we didn't use radio telemetry, where I actually surgically put a transmitter inside the snake, let it go, and then we follow it around, you would never find these snakes again. But here we can go back over and over and over again and find them. And here they're just piled up on the side of this road. Except for right here, there's something going on right there. This snake is happy to go over here, happy to go up there, does not want to cross that road. So if we go down, now we're going down right into here. So one snake was down here, did not cross, but one of them did. So we have actually a single instance where the snake crossed the road, horsed around over here for a while, and then went back to the other side. And there's where it crossed right there. So why did it do that? It did it because it flooded. And so for it, and it's like, hey, the habitat just keeps right on going here. I'll just go ahead and cross over. But then when that stopped, the snake went back. So what they need then is ways to get by roads. And we've been studying that for years, and we found some things out. This was sort of a like, okay, that makes sense. We've also found that they're perfectly happy to go up and down streams underneath bridges. So here's a freeway, and the snakes are going back and forth underneath here. We've also found now that they will use culverts, as long as they're not little tiny culverts. If they've got big culverts that are down against the ground, then all kinds of things will go through there. You know, anything that'll fit will go through there. But if they're little, then there's much less likely to use that. And then the other thing that we discovered is if the road is narrow and the habitat, like here's a wetland over here, and the vegetation is all close, the snakes are much more willing to go over that. We've done research now demonstrating that to be the case. So they don't feel so naked there, and they just shoot across and get to the other side. So roads are a problem, and if you think about how many roads we have, they're everywhere. But all of this wildlife that's out there hesitates to go over them. The animals that you see on the roads are just a tiny fraction of actually what's out there. And so they're a very serious problem. And just as an aside, this can even be a problem for birds. There are, in the tropics, like in the Amazon, there are species of bird where if you have a road like that and you remove the canopy, there are birds that will not cross. All they have to do is fly less than the width of this room to get to the other side, and they won't do it. So roads are a problem. So to wrap up here, hopefully you will concur that shallow wetlands are cool, that they matter. They're not mosquito factories. They're good. In fact, have to dry up in order frequently to be good. What that does, by the way, is perhaps most importantly, it keeps fish out. Fish are really good predators on a lot of amphibian larvae, and it also changes the vegetation when they dry down. And all kinds of cool stuff lives there, even though they're temporary. The wetlands themselves can be very diverse, and all the different kinds are occupied and used. Wetlands are best served with other wetlands. Variety matters, connectivity is key, and roads are a serious problem. So there you have it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I have a question
Sure.
and a joke.
Go for it.
So my question is...
Oh, we need the joke first.
Oh, okay, fine. Why didn't the snake cross the road?
Why?
Because car tires are really scary.
All right. You've earned a question now.
Yeah, well, when you use
Everyone
that,
else has to
your
tell a
performance
joke.
review
Yeah.
ratings skyrocket.
Yeah.
My question is that, like, I'm not a land developer and I don't work in the field and I have no intention to. So, like, what can I as an individual do that would have the most impact
Sure.
on letting these critters roam around and, you know, mate and do all the things that they need to do when I personally don't really feel that much responsibility for destroying their homes.
Well, you actually are responsible.
I know, but I'm saying and I feel really, really bad about it. But I work in pharmaceuticals.
Sure. Yeah. So you can vote. You have money. You can spend money. You can support the ERC, for example. You can, if enough people care and speak about these sorts of things, then that's how things change. We're in the middle of a political cycle right now. We can watch all kinds of things being said. But it actually kind of gets to this. I read something recently, and this is my effort to capture the idea that I read. But I think what I hope to do in a presentation like this is inform people. We need to know about what causes climate change. We need to know why just drinking out of plastic water bottles is a good step, but would be better if you used a reusable cup. People don't seem to be uncontrollable into how much stuff they think they need, and also lack of will. I think these are things that we need to work on, and so for any number of things, be it human rights issues or deciding that it's worthwhile to spend money to protect a snake or things like that, I think it has to do with people deciding that it matters enough to ask that something be done about it. My feeling about these sorts of organisms is that I get another kind of question very frequently is like, sort of comes down to, okay, who cares? You know, what good is this frog? And to me, something doesn't have to have economic value to humans in order to have value. They're intrinsically valuable. And I've started of late talking about something like the Mona Lisa or something like that. We don't just value that because you could sell it and you could make a lot of money. It has value just to go look at it. And so for me, That's how I feel about a lot of this stuff. So I'm willing to pay money to be taxed, to have rules that make it more difficult for us to exploit things as much as we do. That I think is what we can do. And if we're informed, we know what we want to ask for. Yeah.
So a lot of your data is very snake heavy. Are you noticing the same kind of data in relation to roads with turtles and other frogs and other reptiles and amphibians, same thing?
Yeah. There is a variety of responses to roads across. I mentioned some things about birds. Even within snakes, there are certain species that are more willing to cross a road. Many of you probably have seen turtles on roads. Who's seen a turtle on a road? Just about everybody, I would hazard. Those are almost always females that are looking for a place to lay their eggs. If you look at the sex ratio of turtles in areas with a lot of roads, they're almost all male. And the reason is the females are dead because they've tried to cross roads. So there's a group that's more willing. The problem is they get out in the road, and then the cars go by and they freak out and they wait for a while, and then they start to feel a little better and they start to go, and then another car goes by and they freak out. And so holding still on a road is not a very good idea. So there's a variety of responses, but a lot of if you take different taxonomic groups and looked at them, they would respond in a sort of a similar way.
So say you found, a turtle that's frozen in the road and is obviously facing one direction. Do you encourage it to continue on its path, or do you put it back?
Yeah. So in general, I would say try to ascertain which way it wants to go and help it get there. It's more nuanced than that. It depends on the time of day, things like that. But turtles are pretty stubborn. And if you just put it off on the side of the road, it'll say, well, that was dumb. Now I got to go back where I was, and they just try it again. So in general, I would say just try to help it along in the direction that it looks like it's going. It's probably aimed where it had intended to go. And then at least you got it in the right direction. Who knows what will happen after that.
The source of the water for most of the wetlands? Is it just spring runoff, or is it rain, or over?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some of the systems that I was talking about are called fens. Fens are systems of water where it's basically an upwelling. You have water that's down in the ground and it's running along a gravel bed or something like that, and it hits a location where the water is forced out, and it just kind of percolates up onto the surface, and you have little streams that come down. Other places it's just from surface runoff, and still other places, for whatever reason, you have water in a stream and now it leaks over into a shallow area and then forms a wetland there. So all different kinds of sources. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for coming out.
Sure thing. Pull my plug here.
All right, just want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Few notes. We do have meetings on Sundays from 11 to 1 at Old Crown, as well as Wednesdays from 6 to 8 at CS3, if anyone would like to come out. Our next event will be next month, the 10th, actually in the room right next door with Andy Downs on the current political climate. So I'm sure we'll get some information on which presidential candidates are still left. But once again, thanks for coming out, and have a great night.
Hello, my name is Chris Rex. I'm a professor of biology at Ivy Tech. I would just like to go over some further points after listening to the lecture you just did over Shallow Wetlands Complex Thoughts by Dr. Bruce Kingsbury of IPFW. I'd just like to kind of relate this whole topic of wetland conservation more to what it means to you. We can sit here and talk about what wetlands do for plant diversity, for animal diversity, all these great and wonderful ecological and environmental things. But it's really hard to relate it to people in a way that makes them want to care. Why do you really care about species of plants and animals? How does that relate to your life? So I'd just like to kind of elaborate a little bit further along those lines. Starting with one of my favorite topics, venomous snakes. Bruce Kingsbury kind of mentioned throughout his lecture a few different times the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, and how this animal is the only highly venomous snake up here in Indiana. It's very endangered. It's a frequenter of swampland and kind of needs wetlands for its habitat. And that's why they're hurting so much in this state, because they are part of that 95% of habitat that is lost, which means we've lost 95% at least of all those snakes too. And that's really sad to think about. So why do we want to keep these snakes around? They're highly venomous, so obviously they're going to be dangerous if they bite us. So why do we care to keep them around? Well, a couple different reasons. First off, they're actually a close cousin of this other snake called the pygmy rattlesnake. And the pygmy rattlesnake has had its venom developed into a drug called integralin that can be used to treat people with low blood supply problems. So if somebody has their leg turning blue because it's not getting adequate blood supply down there, boom, we can give them this integralin, and it will help clear up that problem, help restore that blood flow. Same thing when it comes to like heart attacks, where you have problems in the coronary arteries, they're blocking up, killing muscle tissue, resulting in this heart attack. Boom, we can use this venom derived drug to save your life. So something that would normally hurt you, we have turned into something to help you. Actually, this has happened in a number of other cases, a number of other snake species. We actually have a dozen different drugs here in the U.S. right now that are saving lives that were all developed from snake venoms. So helping people with heart attacks, with strokes, with clotting disorders. These snake venoms are actually helping save lives right now in the United States. The other cool thing about a number of these snakes, even though they are highly venomous, is that a number of them feed upon rodents in the wild. And what's cool about rodents is that they actually serve as an important first stage in the life cycle of a tick. So once a tick hatches from an egg, it has to get onto a mouse to kind of complete its first stage of its life cycle, after which then it can get on to larger animals like deer, like humans, for instance. And so by reducing the number of mice in the wild, we automatically reduce the number of ticks that are in the wild. In fact, a single timber rattlesnake can reduce as many as 3,000 ticks per year just by that one snake's action on feeding upon those rodents. So that's an incredible impact. And you think, okay, well, fewer ticks to get on me, that's great. Makes my life a little bit more convenient when I'm walking around hiking or whatever in the grass fields. But the real thing to consider here is that each deer tick or black-legged tick can carry Lyme disease, has a potential to carry Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is something that can cause a number of complications in humans and actually result in death in some cases. So if we reduce the amount of deer ticks in the environment, we automatically reduce the amount of Lyme disease in the environment. So we have less of this bacteria hanging around in these ticks that can spread to humans, which means healthier humans. That's great. Awesome. Same thing with the West Nile virus that Kingsbury mentioned. We have less of this virus present in the environment because of changes to mosquito populations in these healthy wetland ecosystems. Different species of mosquito are differentially abundant. This virus doesn't tend to spread very well in certain species. So that's great. Different species, less ability to spread. But we also, in these wetlands, there's a healthy kind of ecosystem going on where a number of things are preying upon the mosquito larvae, such that you can actually have fewer mosquitoes overall in wetlands. And that's great. That further reduces your chance of getting this West Nile virus, having some sort of problems, health problems resulting from that. So with this lower incidence rate of Lyme disease and of West Nile virus, that means that you basically spend less money on healthcare. You have a lower chance of dying, essentially. You get to spend less time off of work due to being sick. So really, overall, it just means more money in your pocket. You know, that's awesome, and a longer, healthier life. The other thing that we can talk about is the frog sickle. All right, the wood frog that was kind of encased in snow and ice there. You take it in, you warm it up, and it's just fine. It survives the freezing process perfectly fine. So how can we relate that to humans? Well, we've been toying around with the idea for the past, 100 years or so, of being able to cryogenically freeze humans. We've not been making very good progress on that. So it's cases like this where we see an animal able to do this freezing action and survive without getting some sort of permanent brain or tissue damage. We can learn from that. If we figure out how these wood frogs do it, we could perhaps apply that to humans and actually have a situation where we can freeze people with terminal illnesses. If they only have a month to live, we can't cure them right now with our current medical knowledge and technology. Just freeze them until we can get a cure for it. Or for long distance space travel. If you want to have humans go off and colonize another planet, another solar system, another galaxy, you have to be able to cryogenically freeze them. Makes things a lot easier to just freeze them for the trip and wake them up, thaw them out once they get to their destination. Aside from all these animals within the wetland itself is a pretty magical place. It has a lot of different neat abilities, such as improving the water quality, for instance. So water that goes through a wetland ends up being kind of cleaned and filtered by all the different things in it, whether it be plants or animals. And if we take one in particular, the cattail, it's a very nice showy plant. Tends to show up in some ditch areas as well. But these cattails have an amazing ability to absorb toxins from the water, including things like arsenic, which is a primary component in rat poison. So if we take this idea and apply it to certain industry operations, those that have to have some sort of runoff into a stream, instead of putting together this fancy, expensive, artificial filter, we can just plant a wetland and let the wetland filter the runoff. Saves us millions of dollars. Absolutely awesome how much advantage we can have by just using wetland instead of all this fancy stuff. Another thing that's great about wetlands is that it's flood protection. Excellent flood protection to where we can have up to 6 inches of water maybe being absorbed by normal grass-covered dirt. But wetland can absorb up to 3 feet of water. So if you have an acre of wetland, you can absorb 1 million gallons of water in that 1 acre. That is an incredible amount of water that can be stored, after a rainstorm. That would normally just flood an entire area, damage homes and property. No, we can just have a wetland there, and it can serve as a great buffer for all this runoff. So it's incredible when we start thinking about all these different advantages to wetlands, because yeah, it's great for flood protection. Yeah, it's great for all these other animals they can have, but we can also relate that to our food industries, to our recreation industries. It's great for hunting and fishing, serving as a great place for mammals and birds. All this stuff. Wetlands are a vital component of the environment, yields several economic and health benefits to people as well as the animals and plants that occupy them. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and Secular Fort Wayne on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.